There's so many different aspects to the therapeutic use of psychedelics, but I think what is really necessary is to go beyond that, to look at the real damage that prohibition causes, and to try to anchor legal access to psychedelics in a wider context so that you don't have to go to a religion to get access to it, you don't have to go to a doctor to get access to it, but that we would all have that direct opportunity to do psychedelics and then under safe, supportive circumstances feel how we're all connected with each other. And from that flows a lot of political implications. And you talked, Governor, about the research about how to turn conservatives into liberals. There's just been a study that came out of Imperial College in London, and what they looked at was those people that had the mystical experience under psilocybin had an increase in nature relatedness and an increase in anti-authoritarian views and more political liberal attitudes. There was other parts of the research community that said that paper should never have been published. And the worry was that this will sort of alert people, politically conservative people, that this is an area of research that they should shut down. And so I don't share that view. I think that we really have to be finding out what it is that we can find out and then share that. And I think the part about reaching out to those people that are sort of what we might think are the ones that need the healing the most controversy actually, the most negative reaction that MAPS has received in the last quite a few years just was over the last couple weeks. And because we put out, I'll tell you some good news, you'll see. There's been incredible media. I'll get to the negative thing. There's been incredible media. This is my favorite headline in decades. Lucy in the Sky with Doctors. And this was the Boston Globe. This was the front page of the ideas section of Boston Globe. And marijuana went medical, then mainstream, are psychedelics next? And the end of this article talked about how some things that initially seem impossible eventually become to seem inevitable. And they're talking about the integration of psychedelic medicine into our society. So within 1 week, this was on a Sunday in the Boston Globe, then we had the Wall Street Journal publish this incredible article. It just came out in the hard copy. It was online on the 17th, but it was about a party drug's path to prescribable medicine. They talked about it as online. It was a club drug to a breakthrough therapy. And so this is now educating an awful lot of conservative people who read the Wall Street Journal about the progress that we're making with psychedelic research. And it's that kind of crossover to the different kind of audiences that we really need to educate. And then there was, the Friday of that week, the American Psychiatric Association put out a newsletter to all the psychiatrists, and it was about MDMA, advances another step as a tool to treat PTSD. And so it was just incredibly sad. I had to pinch myself, like, am I really, is this real? Am I tripping? But we've been making this major outreach in many, many different ways. And so we sent out a newsletter to all the MAPS members and the people on the website and the Facebook page and quite a lot of people. And we talked about these 3 news articles, and then we added a 4th one, which was just 2 weeks before that, which was from Breitbart News. So Breitbart News is the alt-right, fake news, anti-immigrant, anti-white white nationalist. It's the sort of Steve Bannon, it's the Trump base. It's the newspaper, it's the website of the Trump base. And they're also very supportive of veterans. And so one of the veterans was able to get them to do an extremely positive article about MDMA therapy for PTSD. And so I thought that for me was a triumph, that we're doing this crossover, we're educating these people. I saw it kind of as a defensive maneuver. If we can take where there might be opposition and at least educate them, that then we really can be moving more into this society without the kinds of bifurcations and splits that we had happen in the 60s. And what took me by surprise was how many people have written to us, and this has happened in MAPS Canada as well, was how many people said you never should have affiliated with Breitbart, that you shouldn't even have, let people know. You shouldn't have added them into this announcement, that somehow or other people were concerned that we're endorsing Breitbart by saying that Breitbart published this article about MDMA PTSD research. And so we're crafting our response, but part of the response is that we have to speak to those people that might be the most opposed to it, that we think might be the most fearful about what we're trying to do. That's a triumph to try to reach out to those people who are in pain too, and how do we reach them? So it was kind of an unexpected controversy that we created. And I really didn't anticipate it at all, because I've seen it as, just as I said, such kind of a triumph that we've been able to at least get something positive in that context. So I think that's something just for us to be thinking about as we're talking about, because I'm always looking for where is the backlash going to come from? Is there going to be a backlash? I mean, I woke up to LSD in 1972 after the criminalization, after the backlash was well underway. I learned about MDMA in 1982 when it was a secret therapy drug, but it was also being used as ecstasy. And so it was clear that it was going to be criminalized, because that was the Nancy Reagan just say no, escalation of the drug war era. So we were at least able to prepare for the backlash. So now here we are, 50 years after the 60s, and it looks like we're on the verge of really integrating psychedelic medicine into our society. And so I'm constantly trying to scan the horizon. Where is there going to be a backlash? And how do we respond to that? And how do we prevent that? And so mostly now, I don't think that it's the political dimensions. I mean, although I think there is that element, from a political perspective, I think the most important step that's not being taken in psychedelic research yet is going to be to develop ibogaine for the treatment of opiate addiction. Because the areas in America where Trump gets most of his support are those areas that have the most opiate addiction, that have the most despair deaths that are called. And if there's some way that we can reach out and both help people struggling with addiction and also spiritualize them in the process, then I think we'll be bringing the cultures back together again. And so how we do that, we're not working on that right now just because we have so much work to do to try to move MDMA into phase 3. But I'm thinking in the background, how do we bring ibogaine more to the surface? I think that's going to be really crucial for this further integration of psychedelics into the culture. So what I want to do now is just play, it's about a 7-minute or so videotape, and it's a videotape of one of the veterans that was in our study for PTSD.
I don't know, I just got this amazing sense of just, I guess, wisdom. I really don't know.
Sounds a lot like wisdom to me.
It was really amazing. I try and think of that really rageful aspect of me, like I can't even, I know it's there, but it just doesn't, I really feel like so much more at peace with everything.
Great.
Even if I try and think about Iraq and everything, like I somehow feel like really peaceful about the fact that that's my journey. And that,
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
part of me thinking, I mean, I know this is part of the, part of the drug, but when I try and think, am I going to be able to hold on to this, this understanding and this somewhat of wisdom, this knowledge that I have now. I just asked myself that question. I feel like it's so profound that I don't think I could really forget it.
Yeah. So you can also see how different this part of it than an LSD or a psilocybin trip. There's much more relating, there's much more grounded, and you can see how the fear is reduced and how he's been able to negotiate with those parts of himself. And one of the studies that actually is being looked at right now is in Canada. It's at McMaster University, and there's a team there that has focused on the use of metaphor in psychotherapy. And so they're watching our videotapes, and they're trying to understand how people use metaphor in the healing process. So for me, this part that was so interesting when he's talking about a part of himself, and then he says, I know, but it's me too. And yet there's ways in which using metaphors or using descriptors somehow makes it a little bit easier to process. And then you kind of, once you've done that, then you can own it. So this is where the therapy comes from. And what I want to talk for a moment now is just what actually do I think is happening to the progress that we're hoping to make because of the election of Trump and Sessions, and their sort of talk about the return of law and order. And actually, surprisingly, I think that it's actually helped our efforts rather than hurt them. One of the parts is that Trump and Sessions, particularly Trump, is talking about being good to business. And so he's eliminating a lot of environmental protections. He's trying to deregulate all sorts of things. And he's also saying that drugs should be moved through the drug development system even faster. The FDA shouldn't require as much evidence. They shouldn't care as much about the safety. They should sort of move drugs through the system. So in a way, that's the big picture helping us in that way. The other part of it is the veterans. They're very militaristic, and so they're talking about massive increases in the military budget. So what this shows is that as of June 30th, 2016, these are the most available latest numbers. But there was, let's see, if you can see here, there's 868,000 veterans receiving disability payments for PTSD from the Veterans Administration. And there's 1.4 million for when you add depression, anxiety, other mental disorders. So we have almost 1.5 million former soldiers who are disabled to some extent by their war-related service. This is the emotional costs of war. And there's no actual numbers that the VA has put out about the cost of this. But the last numbers that they put out was in 2004. And in 2004, it was $20,000 average annual cost for somebody on disability for PTSD. So using 2004 numbers to today, assuming it's the same, it hasn't changed, the VA is spending $17 billion a year, every single year, mostly for young people who are in the Army. And this is going to go on for many, many decades. And when you talk about all mental health, it's around $29 billion a year. So there's an enormous financial cost, an enormous emotional cost, but sadly the financial cost matters a lot more to policymakers sometimes. So it's this suffering that we're coming to try to help, and so this is, I think, also making it kind of opening the way for us in the culture right now, this burden. I have a person that I've been getting to know really pretty well, and who is the senior advisor to the Secretary of the VA. And so we just had a conversation last week, and what he said was that they recognize this enormous cost, but because MDMA is a Schedule I drug, they're not going to pay a penny for research with MDMA. They see the need, but they feel constrained for political reasons, but they're not going to try to stop what we're doing. They want it to succeed, but they're not ready to actually get directly involved, unfortunately. And so we're actually estimating that the phase 3 costs to move from where we are to make MDMA into medicine is about $26 million. And the good news is that we already have 18 million of that. From a lot of the tech people, 5 million from Dr. Bronner's, the Dr. Bronner soaps. We have early Facebook people, Twitter, Groupon, and then other people who have family resources. So when I found out that the VA would not help us close this $8 million gap, then I said, you know, in a way I was hoping that you'd say no, because I'd like this to be the gift of the psychedelic community to the world. And so for us to be able to say that we've done it without government support, that that's where it came from, I think that's, I mean, I wish they would have said yes, but you know, in the end, it will be the gift of the psychedelic community, the psychedelic underground, coming above ground and trying to help heal so much pain and suffering. So I think that things will be easier. Things are not harder under Trump. Some things are harder under Trump in session. So part of the work of bringing ourselves together, of the mainstreaming psychedelics, is that for about 10 years, I wanted to bring my Burning Man self to and my political selves together. And there's a kind of a space at Burning Man. There's the Burning Man, and then there's the temple where people are grieving things that they've lost. And that's kind of the sacred space of Burning Man, between the man and the temple. And I felt like the sacred space of America is the Washington National Mall, between the Capitol and the Washington Monument. And so I started thinking, how do we bring our Burning Man self to the Washington Mall? And it took 10 years to figure out, but this was 2015. So we actually got a permit, the first time in about 100 years that there was a fire on the National Mall. And this was an all-night event, and it was for healing of trauma. We called it Catharsis on the Mall. And to heal our trauma, we needed all-night dancing. Cathartic dancing, and so we had this DJs and stuff, and so we were right between the White House and the Washington Monument. This is around midnight when we had the fire, and the highlight for me was about 4:30 in the morning, dancing with David Bronner, thinking, my God, we did this, we got away with it, and it actually happened, and we had police that were around us we had a permit, and they were supporting what we do. And then the DJ played Jimi Hendrix, the national anthem from Woodstock. And I just thought, and it was played so loud, you could hear it in the White House. You could hear it all over. But I thought, now, from the Woodstock, from that point, now here we are, we have a permit, and we're able to do this. Now, this was under Obama. And so we had another event last year on the mall, and we're going to have another one in November on Veterans Day. It's always on Veterans Day. And so this year we were going to bring this statue. This year it was going to be for the Equal Rights Amendment for women. We thought that was particularly a pertinent issue now. And so we actually got a permit from the Park Service to bring this statue from Burning Man to Washington, D.C. To be on the mall. But then there was a couple articles about, you know, nude woman on the mall. And unfortunately, this was the mock-up. So the New York Times reported how the Park Service revoked the permit. It was going to be over $100,000 to move it, and we'd raised almost all the money. And so statue of naked woman blocked from National Mall. So there are some conservative forces that we've not really been able to negotiate successfully with, so this is not happening. Other than here, in most places, marijuana, this is initiatives, marijuana got more votes than Trump. So marijuana is way more popular than Trump. And so even though Attorney General Sessions and Trump have talked about trying to block medical marijuana states or compromise the marijuana legalization in the states, they've not actually done that. But what they have done is blocked the licensing of private production of marijuana. So right now, the reason we're able to make progress with MDMA is that we have our own independent source of MDMA, and the FDA is putting science over politics. We, unfortunately, in America, only have one source of federally legal marijuana, and it's the federal government. And so they can only supply for research, not for prescription use. And they don't have very good quality, and that's been a big problem for us, and they've denied permission in the past. So we've been working on this since 2000, and in 2015, there was an extra review of marijuana studies by the Public Health Service. You had to have FDA, DEA, IRB, and then you had to have this extra review committee, and they just were focused on saying no. And so we finally managed to get rid of that committee. The Public Health Service Committee is gone in 2015. And then in 2016, in the summer, again under Obama, the DEA announced that it would now license private production. And there has not been private production in America since 1968. That's when the government monopoly started. And that's the key to making marijuana into a medicine. And so the DEA announced that they would end this monopoly and they would license other firms. And since then, 26 applicants have submitted their applications, but once Trump got elected, nobody's been actually given the license. The DEA doesn't want to say no, because once they say no, then you can sue them for their reasons for saying no. But if they say nothing, then they technically can say nothing for years. Eventually you can sue them for unreasonable delay, but the courts in the past, we have sued the DEA for that in the past, and after 3 years, and the court said that's not necessarily unreasonable delay. So this is the major area, I'd say, where the election of Trump and Sessions is blocking us. However, 2 weeks ago, there was a congressional hearing, and Orrin Hatch, a senator who's a Republican, was questioning Sessions, and one of the questions was about this marijuana monopoly, and Hatch was saying you should end this monopoly, and Sessions said he's willing to think about it, that it could be healthy. So there may be some positive change even here, but it's easy for him to say things, whether he'll actually license other things. But this is where our political team is really focusing now. And the reason is because if politics can block science when it comes to marijuana, that could be something that could backlash to psychedelics. So trying to fight this blockade in a way of drug development research with marijuana is a way, I think, of defensively trying to protect the gains we've made in psychedelics, sort of moving the front line and keeping the focus there. So we're going to continue to try to focus on that. But the key message is that with psychedelics, there are no regulatory obstacles. There really is an open door, and it's now up to us to try to do the science, to try to work with the regulatory system and try to prove in the context and the way that they want to see it that we can demonstrate safety and efficacy. And I think if we can do that, if the FDA says yes, MDMA is a medicine, the DEA must reschedule. The law says that the DEA has only 90 days. Once the FDA says yes, the DEA must make it into a schedule where it can be prescribed. So there's a lot of safeguards in the law, I think, to think that we actually will be able to, if we can actually get the data that shows safety and efficacy, we will be able to make this into a medicine. So where is the data? What data do we actually have? In phase 2, it started in 2000. We spent 16 years basically doing studies in Canada, in Israel, in Switzerland, and in the United States. And we've treated 107 people. One of the things that's surprising in a way is that we don't have a single African American. I think it relates, Governor, to the sense of safety. I think that you become more defenseless when you're under psychedelics, and if people are not feeling safe in the culture, they're not likely to be as much volunteering. I mean, this was a surprise to us because we're doing a lot of work with veterans, and a lot of African Americans and minorities are in the military. And so I just automatically assumed that we would have a diverse population of patients, but not a single African American has volunteered for the studies. So now we've actually reached out. There's a group at the University of Connecticut that looks at PTSD from racial trauma. And so we've now trained the first group of African American therapists, and they're one of the teams for phase 3. And so hopefully we'll get more diversity in the phase 3 studies. But this is cross countries, cross-cultural, and the results were pretty remarkable. So what we have here is a 40-hour process of psychotherapy, basically. It's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, and then 3 MDMA sessions, 3 day-long MDMA sessions with an overnight stay and integrative psychotherapy the next day. And then 2 months after the last MDMA session is the primary outcome measure, and that's when we gather the data that I'll be showing you now. And it's male-female team, so it's a 2-person team. So it's labor-intensive, but it is for this creating the safety. And so with inactive placebo or the low dose that we're using to try to increase the blinding, what we showed is that 23% of the people chronic treatment-resistant PTSD at the 2-month follow-up no longer had PTSD. So this is the control group. And when you add MDMA, after just 2 sessions, it's more than twice as good. It's up to 55%. And the way we did the study is after the second session, we would uncover the blind, and those people that were in the placebo group could go through it again. Open label, meaning they all knew they were getting MDMA. And then the people that were in the MDMA group would go on to their 3rd session. So the next slide is everybody lumped together, whether it was double blind or open label after 3 sessions, and now it's 61%. So the real question, though, is does it last? Is this a psychedelic afterglow? Is this something that's temporary? Is this like, there was just the head of psychiatry at Columbia, Jeffrey Lieberman, who wrote an article in Medscape just a few days ago criticizing this work. And he didn't really understand it. He didn't really pay much attention to it, but he was like, this drug, ecstasy, just takes away your problems, and it makes you feel good, but that's not the same as being cured of PTSD. He sort of even thought that maybe you need to take it every day, where it's only given a few times. So this next slide, this next one is the 1 year or more follow-up, and it's now even better. 2/3 of the people who are chronic treatment resistant, substantial amounts of PTSD, no longer have PTSD a year later. So this is what, So it's the combination of the compassionate care from the therapists and the opportunity that MDMA gives people through reducing activity in the amygdala to helping them work through difficult emotions. And so I think there's a very good chance that once we move to phase 3 that we're going to get results pretty similar to this. Now, the things that we learned in phase 2 is meant to be exploratory pilot studies, and the purpose of it is to figure out how to design phase 3. So the first thing that we learned here is that in our treatment, the cause of PTSD is irrelevant, that it works with childhood sexual abuse, it works with war-related trauma, it works with accidents, it works. So once somebody gets, there's even prolonged grief, there's different ways where once people have PTSD, the cause doesn't really matter, and at least from the point of view of our treatment. So the real good news is that we can enroll anybody with PTSD. It's not just subgroups, and the drugs Zoloft and Paxil that are approved by the FDA for PTSD, they did not work in combat-related PTSD, and one of them only worked in women and not in men. So automatically already, this is really important. We also learned that the clever idea that I had about how we're going to solve the double-blind problem using low-dose MDMA as the control condition, it didn't actually work. Because what happened was the low dose, it did increase the blinding, but it made people more activated and agitated, but it didn't reduce the fear enough. So the people that got 25, 30, or 40 milligram actually had an anti-therapeutic effect. So when we presented this to the FDA, we said, we can produce blinding for you if you want it, but it's going to make it easier to make a difference between the group that's the full dose MDMA and our control group. And so we said, you know, we'll leave this up to you how you want us to do the control group, but we proposed an inactive placebo. So it's really testing the therapy with the therapy plus MDMA. And that's the real question, is why do you need to add a drug? If the therapy can do it, why bother add a drug? So that's what we learned. We also learned that it's safe, that we could administer this in a safe context, and that there is a medium to large effect size.
Oh, great. Then it's no longer double blind, right?
Well, it's a very interesting point, and we just had one of the things, I think mostly that's true, yeah. So what the FDA has said is that a lot of times double blind doesn't actually work anyway with psychiatric drugs because they have so much of a side effect profile that people can actually, it's called piercing the double blind, where you figure out, so that it doesn't work in practice as much as we'd like it to anyway with other psychiatric drugs. But what they've said was that the most important things then are random assignment, that everybody is similarly motivated, and then you randomly assign them to the control group or your test group, and then the process by which the ratings are done of the PTSD symptoms. There has to be independent raters who are not the therapists, and we have to do a very complicated process where we have a pool of over 20 raters, and in the phase 2, we would have a rater who would take people's baseline and then follow them through the study. So we have to break that connection, and so it's random through telemedicine so that a rater doesn't necessarily know, is this the 2-month follow-up, the primary outcome measure, is this after the first or second or third MDMA session? Now, the reason that I wasn't completely clear about breaking the double blind is we've had 2 situations, both with psychiatrists. So we have permission from the FDA to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. That was about 8 years ago, and that was a key step for us to believe that the FDA really wanted to help us succeed. So we created a protocol. We can give MDMA to therapists, and we can bring therapists from all over the world. And so I happened to be in Boulder a couple weeks ago after one of the therapists from Europe came. He's a psychiatrist, and he came to participate in this session. So the way this protocol is written, it's 4 days. You come the first day, you get oriented. The second day, you get a session. So it's actually 5 days. So the second day you get session, and it's either MDMA or inactive placebo, and it's randomized. Then you have a day of integration, and then you have the crossover, and then you get what you didn't get, and then another day of integration. So the psychiatrist from Europe who came to be in this study had never done MDMA before, wasn't from the psychedelic community, but was very knowledgeable about trauma, about psychotherapy. And he had this incredible day of just processing childhood trauma, processing all sorts of issues. And it was so deep that everybody, the therapists, both therapists, the patient and the patient's co-therapist, because the co-therapist comes and we switch off so we can take a team of 2 in the shorter amount of time. So everybody thought that it was MDMA. And then when he went to the crossover, they were like, this is going to be a short day, we're going to go out to dinner. And then after about an hour and a half, he was processing stuff from the previous session. He just stopped talking. And he couldn't talk for 2.5 hours. And all he was doing was like hand signals. And so at one point he was pointing at all the books on the shelves in the treatment room, and he was looking at the books, and he was saying, like it's all the feelings. And so he was completely convinced. Everybody was completely convinced. And then it turns out that that's happened one other time, and it was also a psychiatrist who was completely confused. And so, but what he did say after, and I met him now after the placebo session, the day after the placebo session, he said that he could tell the difference was that it was deeper and more profound with the MDMA, and that there was a little bit of sort of cognitive driving of the emotions when he had the placebo. He was able to convince himself that now was the time. He was in a safe place. He can look at all these issues, and so it was sort of effortless and deeper. But so there are occasions when the double-blind actually works, even when it's an inactive placebo. But I think in practice, most of the time it will fail. And so the FDA has accepted that. Now, we also use a measure of mystical experience. It's the same measure used in psilocybin research. It's used in LSD research. It came from the Good Friday experiment. It's been slightly modified. We use it in MDMA research. And 0.6 is what you need to have. 0.6 here is for a full mystical experience. So the low doses of MDMA, a mean was 0.15, which is not very much. But active doses, there's a mean of 0.46. And you look at the variability here, the range, there's about actually quite a few people that had a full mystical experience under MDMA. But what we've shown is that there is no correlation between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcome when it comes to treating trauma from MDMA for PTSD. The key factor for the LSD research, for the psilocybin research, is that the depth of the mystical experience is correlated with therapeutic outcome. For end of life, for addiction, for depression. This is true for ayahuasca research, even for depression, that the depth of the mystical experience is correlated with therapeutic outcome with the classic psychedelics, but it's not with MDMA. So that helps also to explain why our therapeutic method is non-directive. We're not trying to move people to a mystical experience. And I think what the explanation is that you need to be grounded in your biography. You need to take a memory that is so linked to fear, and you need to sort of look at that from a fear reduction place where you're feeling safe. And then when the memory is reconsolidated, and there's a lot of research now being done on how this actually works physiologically, but when you can look at a memory that's traumatic but you're feeling safe, you're also able to place it in the past and to recognize that it's not happening that moment. So you're temporarily putting it from PTSD, where it's always about to happen, it's always seeming that it's in the present almost, you've never been able to process it. And so I think you need to be grounded in your biography, in your ego, in your kind of humanness, and that the mystical experience is something different. It can be very helpful, very healing, it can do a lot, but I think for the healing of trauma, it's not as much. It's certainly not necessary. So that's one of the key factors we've learned in phase 2. I wanted to just share this, to share what we're doing more in Canada. Candace Monson is at Ryerson University in Toronto. And so we're trying to reach out to the VA. As I said, we're not getting a penny from the VA, but we're actually giving a grant. Little Tiny Maps is giving a grant to the big military to do research with MDMA. And so Candace has developed an approach, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, where conjoint means couple or dyad. So it's one member of the dyad has PTSD, but it affects the relationship. And so the National Center for PTSD, we had a lot of political work from Richard Rockefeller and his cousin, Senator Jay Rockefeller. And we had meetings with the Department of Defense and the Pentagon and the VA. And they said, start with veterans and start with this study. And so they gave Candace permission to work with us on this study. And so it's working out fantastic. And we have permission to give both members of the dyad MDMA. So this is also suggesting how MDMA and how psychedelics will move into the culture beyond just medicine, beyond just the patient. So that we'll start treating the patient, but we'll also start treating the family of patients. And they're not necessarily diagnosed with PTSD or depression, but they're all part of the same system. So Candace and her associate Ann Wagner decided that they've talked about it, so I can share this. They also participated in the study where they took MDMA. And they did that with Michael and Annie Mithofer, and they sort of bonded on them. And they decided that there's a lot to this therapy that they needed to learn. So instead of them taking MDMA and going through a training program and then doing this study at Ryerson in Toronto, they decided that they would travel frequently down to Charleston, South Carolina, to partner. One of them is partnering with Michael, one of them with Annie. So it's actually our first example of a female-female team. It's not always a male-female team, and it's working well. And so they're at the 7th dyad now, and they're completely persuaded that MDMA has got incredible potential. So, and then the next step, once that's done, is they're going to move it up to Toronto. So this kind of research will be coming to Canada, and this is not part of our phase 3 design. This doesn't help us to make it into a medicine, but it helps us by educating the VA therapists. And there's another approach called cognitive processing therapy, and another one called prolonged exposure. Those are the main non-drug psychotherapies. So there's a woman named Barbara Rothbaum who's helped develop prolonged exposure. She's at Emory University, so she's working with us to do MDMA combined with prolonged exposure, and Candace is going to do a study with MDMA with cognitive processing therapy as well. So we took all this data to the FDA on November 29th, 2016, 16 years of phase 2 data. And we presented this, and it was our view, we were trying to say to FDA, we've learned enough from phase 2, we're ready to move into phase 3. And this was in the New York Times the next day. FDA said yes. So they agreed to new trials for ecstasy. We wish they wouldn't have said ecstasy. We're trying to say it's MDMA, it's not a party drug. You know, don't keep talking about it as a party drug, but anyway, we got permission. So what happened though is that there's a program called Special Protocol Assessment. And this is where it gets to the methodology question. So that once you're a pharmaceutical company and you have gotten permission to go to phase 3, you can go immediately to phase 3. And pharmaceutical companies are in a race. They've got patents that are expiring. So there's a lot of them will start immediately. But there's this program called Special Protocol Assessment where you negotiate every aspect of the protocol design with the FDA. And at the end, if you come to agreement, you get an agreement letter. And what that means is the FDA is committed to no longer criticizing your methodology. If you get evidence of safety and efficacy, they will approve the drug. The only caveat is if there's a new safety problem that arises. So we decided we needed, because of the double-blind problem, we needed to go through this. And so it took us 6 months extra, but July 28th, we got that agreement letter from FDA. And I think this is really the most important agreement that we have with FDA, because a lot of people could criticize that the double-blind didn't work and we should have done something else. But now, because of this agreement letter, we can't be criticized on that basis. And then, August 16th, we got something that's even bigger in many ways. It's called Breakthrough Therapy Designation. And so this is the most important program that the FDA has for the most promising drugs. It turns out about 2/3 of the applications from pharmaceutical companies to have their drug declared a breakthrough therapy are rejected. So it really is difficult to get breakthrough therapy. But if you do get it, the majority of drugs that are given breakthrough therapy actually become approved. Now, I knew that we qualified for breakthrough therapy. It's a serious or life-threatening illness. You have to have a new approach. But what I didn't know is whether the FDA was willing to be so public, because this agreement letter that we got for special protocol assessment, that's not as newsworthy. It's not as dramatic. It's more inside baseball kind of thing. And so the willingness of the FDA to declare MDMA a breakthrough drug is something that the DEA sees, the Drug Czar's office sees, the members of Congress sees, everybody sees this. And yet the FDA was willing to say yes to breakthrough. So that's, for me, the final step, that the FDA is putting science over politics. And so what this also means is that the FDA then is now going to engage us in discussions about commercialization. So we're going to be preparing ahead of time, and then FDA has certain timelines where you want a meeting, they have to respond in certain days, so the timelines are shortened. And so we've just filed for our first meeting under breakthrough. That's going to be either December or January. And the issues that we're discussing, we have to start thinking about a brand name. We have to start thinking about how we're going to scale up to meet the need. We have to start thinking about off-label prescriptions.
Have you thought about ecstasy?
Well, we actually have thought about MDMA, if we could like have our brand name MDMA, but I don't think we can do that. But ecstasy, absolutely not. And we have, because we're doing this in a nonprofit way, we have now a team from a pharmaceutical marketing company that has volunteered their time to help us figure out the brand name. So we have a team of about 6 people that are all working for free, trying to come up with a brand name. We're going to have phase 3 sites, actually 16 sites, and these are all the places where we're going to have it. I'll say that the sites in Canada and the sites in Israel are crucial because I talked earlier about backlash, and so having an international strategy is actually absolutely essential. So if there were to be a backlash in the US, we would still have the sites in Canada, the sites in Israel, and the FDA accepts foreign data. Once you've done the protocol and the FDA accepts it, then you can do the studies absolutely anywhere. So we're having a few studies that are in research institutions, UCSF, NYU, University of Wisconsin and Madison, University of Connecticut, here at the British Columbia Center for Substance Use. But most of them are in private practice. Most of them are kind of customized settings in private practice, and these will be sites that will eventually become treatment sites once it's a prescription medicine. And this is the basic protocol that we've got approved by the FDA. So this is the methodology. Everybody gets screened and enrolled in the study. We're having to do it between 200 and 300 subjects, and we won't know depending on the effect size. But there's 3 preparation sessions that everybody gets to prepare them for the first therapeutic session. At this point, they don't know which group they're in. And then the first session is going to be 80 milligrams or inactive placebo. And that's because we found out in the study with veterans that the 75 milligram group did even better than the 125 milligram group. It really surprised us how well it did. And the videotape that you saw was someone that got 75 milligrams. And there's a supplemental dose, half the initial, that's given up around 1.5 to 2.5 hours later. And so there's a little variation there. But there's these 3 prep sessions, then there's 3 integration sessions between each of these 3 experimental sessions. These are 3 to 5 weeks apart, and then total of 9 integrations, and then there's the 2-month follow-up. So that's the experiment, and the data here is what's going to be used by the FDA for approving it. We're also in a separate add-on study doing 1-year follow-up. And that's more for insurance companies to try to make it so that we can show that insurance companies should pay for it. So we want to talk about the longevity of the effect, and we also want to study people's other healthcare utilization, because people with PTSD have more stress, have more problems in many different ways. They go to the emergency rooms for panic attacks, they have more heart problems. PTSD is linked to a whole host of problems. So our challenge now is going to be able to show insurance companies that we're doing more than just treating PTSD. We're actually reducing their healthcare costs. And so that's what the 12-month follow-up will be for. Now, we're also going to be negotiating now, starting very soon with the European Medicines Agency. And it's going to probably take us till the summer or the fall of 2018 to have that figured out with the EMA. These are the sites so far in Prague and Utrecht, Amsterdam, Berlin, Hanover, Bristol, Cardiff, and other sites. So we've sort of trained some of these people. Some of them got partial training, and we'll probably start at the end of 2018 to train the Europeans. And the reason that we're doing this is that, well, first off, there's an enormous need everywhere, but also that there's similar regulatory structures. So most of the data that the European Medicines Agency will require, we will have already gathered for the FDA. So while it's $26 million more to go to make MDMA into medicine through the FDA, that might even be enough for Europe, or it'll be like another 5 to 10 million at the most. So we'll be able to more than double the population that'll be able to receive legally MDMA. Well, Switzerland, they're right now doing compassionate use. So the Swiss doctors where we worked with LSD and MDMA, they now have this program where they are actually being able to treat patients already under a compassionate use program. And so that's actually what this is. So this is, in the US, it's called expanded access. So we believe MDMA will be approved as a medicine in 2021. That's our current timetable. But in 2019, it should be possible to, and I'm not sure exactly what the rules are in Canada, and we have to find that out. But in the US, if there is a drug that's being researched and somebody has the disease that it's being researched for, but other things have failed, there are procedures that the FDA has to provide it to people before the drug is even approved. And the patients can pay for it themselves. That's the other thing. It's incredible. So we're actually thinking that in the summer to fall of 2019, we will be able to open up psychedelic clinics in the United States, possibly in Canada. Mark earlier today was saying that in Canada, it's on a patient-by-patient basis. In the US, you can have a general protocol under expanded access. The Republicans have passed a lot of laws in America in different states called right to try laws, mostly for cancer drugs. But what it means is that you should have a right to try a drug that's in research, even if it's not approved. And the FDA will not hold against the pharmaceutical company if there's unusual side effects or problems, because it's not as controlled a situation as the phase 3 trials. So you have to show that your phase 3 studies are underway, that you have a waiting list, you're not slowing down the phase 3 studies, and the pharmaceutical companies can sell the drug only at what it costs them, and people can pay for their own treatments. So it could be that, you know, all of you who are going to be working here on the phase 3 study can also set up private practices to work with additional patients. And the thing about expanded access, and one of the most important things, is that you can work with more complicated cases. So we require people to have 60 days no substance abuse disorder. But PTSD and trauma drives people to addiction. And a lot of people aren't able to actually get over the addiction long enough for 2 months to qualify to be in the study. So the most important extension of what we want to do next is work with dual diagnosis, people that are actually still addicted and have PTSD. And so that's something that we can do in expanded access. And again, I'm not sure what Health Canada will say about that. But that's I think, the next step to do that. And the FDA grants 99% of these applications. It's almost a sure thing. And they actually want us to do this. And we want to do it because it's also going to be training more therapists. So we'll have a lot more therapists ready once it's able to be prescribed. Now, how is it going to be prescribed? So the FDA has a program called Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. This was developed initially for thalidomide. Thalidomide is the drug given to women for morning sickness. It caused terrible birth defects, and it was blocked from entering the US. The only person at the FDA that has ever received the Presidential Management of Medal of Honor was the woman, Frances Kelsey, that blocked thalidomide from being a medicine in the US. But now, thalidomide is a medicine in the US for cancer, certain kinds of cancer. But there's all kinds of programs to try to make sure that no pregnant women get thalidomide. So what we're going to do, so now FDA has expanded its power to control drugs specific to the risks of those drugs. And so what we're going to be proposing, and this is what we're working out with this breakthrough therapy and this meeting coming right up, is we're going to say that unlike most drugs that once they're prescribed, they're prescribable, any doctor could prescribe them. So right now, most psychiatric medicines are not prescribed by psychiatrists. General practitioners prescribe an enormous amount of psychiatric medications, and they can do that. But we're going to say that only those people that have been through our training program are going to be able to prescribe MDMA. And that it's only in clinics, it's only in supervised settings. It's never going to be a take-home drug. And only with certain kind of safety screening. So we're trying to help the regulators feel comfortable putting this out. And the REMS is the way we're going to do it. And the key part is, again, the training. So we have a 14-hour online course. We have a week-long in-person training. Then we ask people to do home studies. We have another week-long training about working in groups. Then we have this part that we're doing now where it's here in Canada, it's elsewhere, that all the people that we've trained have not actually worked with a PTSD patient, because the only way we can do that is in the context of a protocol, because MDMA is an illegal drug. So the normal way you train therapists is they work with patients and they're supervised and they get feedback. So we can only do that in a study. So it's added $1 million to our costs, but we feel that it's too risky to start phase 3 with therapists that have never actually worked with a PTSD patient with MDMA. So that's starting now, that study. We call it MP17 here in Canada. It's been approved by Health Canada just about a week and a half ago. And then the part that's optional is people receiving MDMA under supervision. And I think the point there is that we don't want to create a cult-like thing where everybody has to do the drug. We want to welcome skeptics. So if some skeptic says, I want to go through your training program and I even want to work with MDMA, we're not going to require that they take MDMA. We wouldn't hire them for phase 3 if we felt that they were scared of taking MDMA themselves. But I think it's important that it be optional and not a requirement. And then one of the key issues that we have to negotiate is off-label prescription. So once a drug is approved for one thing, it can be prescribed for other things. So the people that we've trained will have the ability to prescribe it, but to what extent can they prescribe it for things other than PTSD? So that's going to be a big negotiation with FDA. And I just learned the other day, I was thinking that we wanted to have a registry where therapists would say to us, well, you know, these 6 patients are getting it for PTSD, but these few patients are getting it for anxiety or depression or something else. And I just was informed by a big DC lawyer that that's illegal, that we can't knowingly sell it for off-label prescriptions. We can only sell it for PTSD. So we're going to have to figure out some way, and they recommended maybe the expanded access, that we create protocols for all these other uses that people could conceivably use MDMA for. So there'll be more control, but there will be some off-label prescription. And then the issue, of course, is going to be insurance. And how do we get that covered? And so we're trying to gather that data. And then how we're going to sell it and how we're going to do this, because we're actually the pharmaceutical company. And so we're going to be selling MDMA by prescription. And one of the things that's really bad, I think, about a lot of modern medicine and pharmaceutical companies is they're profit maximizing companies. And they try to get as much money as they can. And they don't really take into account a lot of other issues. And that's one of the main concerns we hear about legalizing marijuana, that you get big alcohol, big tobacco, and they're going to market to kids and do all this stuff, and because they're profit maximizing. So there's a modification of capitalism called the benefit corporation, where you maximize public benefit. So MAPS has created a benefit corporation to sell MDMA. And the benefit corporation is for profit, it's taxable. Our goal is to sell MDMA for more than it cost us, but not that much more. And then with the profits, invest that in more research. And so instead of always having to come to donors and say, give us more money, now we want to do this, and now we want to do this, and now we want to do that, we're that rare nonprofit that has a product at the end. And the product is a prescription drug. Or it could be multiple prescription drugs. It could be Ibogaine, but we're going to do this through the Public Benefit Corporation. And so people make tax-deductible donations to MAPS. MAPS invests in the Public Benefit Corporation. The Public Benefit Corporation does the research and will eventually sell the drug. And so we're trying to, again, demonstrate a new way to market drugs. And then eventually there'll be psychedelic psychotherapy clinics. This will be one of them out in the country. This will be one in the city. You'll go to Google Maps and you'll say, where's the psychedelic clinics? And we will be able to make this become more than a dream together. Thank you.
Any questions? discussing this or not?
Yeah.